Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our broadcast today. I saw that we have around 200 people joining us live through LinkedIn today. I will just go through a couple of housekeeping slides, tell you a bit more about ACSS, and hopefully in the meantime, a lot of more people will join us. This is a free broadcast, so some of you might have seen it come up on their page because you are engaged with sanctions and you work in export controls or any type of compliance. Because I think this broadcast might apply to any area of compliance. So thanks for joining us. For those of you who don't know ACSS yet, I will briefly talk about ACSS so you can join our association if you're interested. Next slide, please. Let's have a look. Thanks. So ACSS is the Association of Certified Sanctions Specialists. And we are the only association dedicated exclusively to the worldwide sanctions professionals. We have members from Southeast Asia, from Africa, from Europe, North America, South America, from all continents, Australia as well. Except for Antarctica, I think all the continents are represented in our association. And we have over 1,600 members, and we are constantly growing. And I will tell you why. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of interesting membership benefits. Once you become a member, you will be able to join our webinars, which are not for free. Some of them are for free if they are sponsored, but most of our webinars on sanctions and export controls are for members only. So if you are a member, you can also join our weekly webinars on hot topics relating to sanctions and export controls. We have local chapters, which are in-person meetups in the big cities around the world where you can meet other ACSS members and sanctions professionals. We have chapters in London, New York, Washington, Singapore, Berlin, Paris, and for the Benelux, they meet in Amsterdam or Brussels. So if you want to meet, other sanctions professionals, you will be able to meet them at our local chapters. We have monthly Sanctions Connect calls, and we had one last Friday with an OFAC expert who answered all of your burning questions on sanctions compliance related to OFAC. So if you have a question that is like bothering you at work, you can always come to our Sanctions Connect calls and ask an expert. We have an interactive sanctions map, which we keep up to date, which summarize all the sanctions laws and regulations from the US, the UK, the EU, Switzerland, and Canada. So we have to update them also based on the latest EU sanctions package that we've seen last week and all the new measures that BAS announced. A couple of other things which I don't have to mention. Let's just move on to the next slide. In order to become a CSS, as you see on my title here, Alexander Witt CSS, or supposed to say CSS, Certified Sanctions Specialist. You can become a Certified Sanctions Specialist if you follow our certification program. We offer multiple programs per year. So you need to follow our classes or do your self-study, and then you will be tested with a rigorous exam. And if you pass it, you will become a CSS or Certified Sanctions Specialist. Please check out our website for the upcoming dates. Next slide, please. Because of the Russia sanctions, we've seen a lot of guidance documents being published on sanctions evasion, and we created a hub for all these documents that you can visit for free on our website. So please visit our website for a lot of guidance documents by the main regulators. Next slide, please. Our flagship event for this year is the Global Sanctions and Export Control Conference on the 11th and the 12th of April in Amsterdam. So if you happen to be in Europe, or if you want to meet ACSS members and listen to amazing speakers and learn a lot about what is happening in the sanctions and export controls world, please visit us in Amsterdam and join the conference. It's in a couple of weeks already and a couple of limited seats left. Next slide, please. Okay, before I tell you about our next webinars, let's just turn off the presentation now and let's give our speaker Justin the floor, who will give us a lot of tips and advice on how to create the best compliance training, especially in 2024, after all these regulations we've seen last year, especially with relation to Russia sanctions. Justin, thanks for joining us. Thanks for doing this training. And I should also mention we will do a webinar for our ACSS members, which will be a 1-hour webinar in May on the same topic.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that as well. I'm glad everybody was able to join today. Anytime you're looking at a compliance training program, particularly in sanctions, it all starts out with putting a structure and a framework around the plan for the year. OFAC did disseminate 5 essential components that should be in a sanctions compliance program. One of them is training. So training is a pillar that we have to look at, and we have to look at our regulators to determine what they're looking for. With your program itself, there's a lot of due diligence to do up front. You want to make sure that you account for all the risks of your organization, particularly when it comes to sanctions. That means doing a thorough needs analysis for your organization to determine, what's keeping people up at night and what could be used as far as training or communications venue for particular topics. During my years in corporate, when I was designing these programs, I would look at the risk assessment. I would look at audit. I would look at legal. I would talk to business heads. I'd find out as much information as I can to create a program that made sense for that particular organization, because it's going to differ depending on where you are. It's going to be, firms could have different products, services, or geographic locations that you have to take into account with your program. Now, on the basic training program, essentially when you establish your training program for the year, you're going to have certain components that are kind of the same year after year. For example, we may all be required with our firms to do annual training on AML, or there could be standalone trainings on sanctions. Now, with your program as a whole, you're going to have those core basics year after year, but that's the easy part. Now, during the course of the year, you have to account for changes in the environment, regardless if they're, announcements by regulators, proposals in a few. These are things that you have to keep in mind, because your training program is going to be, it's a live document that's going to change during the course of the year when you look at these new regulations or new actions. Specifically with OFAC, there's been a lot of news over the last couple of weeks alone. Russian sanctions, which we know a lot about. Previously, we had Iran, and there were a lot of other things that we need to take into account when we look at training. Because, for example, the Russian sanctions, for instance, we'll use this as an example because it's only about 3 or 4 days old. The firm as a whole be privy to what's going on. I mean, not everybody reads the newspapers, but you do need awareness to the organization as a whole about what's going on and what are the implications for your firm. That's just the first step. OFAC and other regulatory agencies want you to be very tailored in your approach. So, for example, if one department is really in the weeds regarding sanctions, it would be more customized or more tailored training for that particular audiences. So the first step is, training for all, or awareness for all. Get into the individual teams that are actually going to be, this information is going to be incorporated in their day-to-day. So if you're working with sanction regarding upcoming training or anything that's new, first you need to ensure that the sanctions department incorporated all the new information. That's just a double check I always do, and working with them so I can understand exactly what's going on and what changes are going to be dictated based on these sanctions. So once you have all that information, you could work with sanctions to come up with the proper communications to really impacted staff and the necessary training. Now, with the Russian sanctions, it could be a couple of system tweaks, updating the SDN, looking at updates from the SDN, and looking at the components of this particular sanctions case, because the implications could spread throughout your organization without not even knowing it. You have to think of who does the sanctions department coordinate with it within the organization. There could be front office, middle office that are involved. It's not just compliance that needs a training. Again, you have to really look or do your own needs analysis and understand who else needs this. Because if you don't have training or you don't have awareness, no one's going to know what to do. Everyone's hands are going to be up in the air wondering, what's the next step? What do we do? How do our roles and responsibilities differ from today, looking at this past Friday? It may or may not. It could just be awareness driven. So that's an important part. But the coordination effort is key, because you want to work with sanctions in particular to make sure the message gets across. And I think that's really important. So if we take just a look back, you have your core sanctions compliance training program. You have the refresher elements that usually happen annually, but then you have the one-offs or continuous information that you have to disseminate. So like I said, your training program for the course of the year, it's going to look different from January 1 to December 31. And you have to be open to those changes, and that's also staying aware of the news. One thing that I always did when I was in corporate, I used to get feeds from all the regulators. So as soon as it was announced, I had the information in my email box, and I could think about what's going to happen and what do I need to do to make sure that people understand the changes that are in our environment now. So doing that due diligence is really important, because you're going to have these one-offs. We don't know if OFAC is going to sanction other nations or, go to the third step with Russia in the future. We don't know. But we have to be adaptable to those changes and educate staff appropriately. The quick, easy thing is always send an awareness message for to the whole firm, wish them, goodbye and good luck. But if you really want to do something important and make sure that people understand what to do, you have to look at the tailored approach, because the tailored approach, the time requirement that you put into it, is what you're going to get out of it. And you also have to make sure there's other elements as well. When you're doing training for any individual or any team within your organization, you got to know what they do for a living. As part of my roles, I couldn't put forth a solid and effective training plan if I didn't know what people did for a living. So if you're in that role where, thinking about, what to do with training on sanctions, it's important to understand what each person does for a living, because they customize it effectively. It's like knowing your target audience. If you don't know your target audience, you're going to do some generic high-level training that's not going to be beneficial for the users. And I would not want to put you in that predicament. So Alex, based on all of that, and also, what's been done over the last couple of weeks and what's possibly going to be in the future, because 2024 is shaping up to be possibly, one of the historic years for rules and regulations. If you just follow FinCEN, for instance, getting alerts every day. Some are minor, some are items that I really need to consider for training. But get those feeds so you can stay up to date in the news, and don't worry for, a third person or somebody else to indicate.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the changing role of a compliance officer, or let's say a sanctions compliance officer. I think that one of the trends that we observed last year was that more and more export control related information is being fed to sanctions professionals, such as the secondary sanctions now announced by the US that expect banks or financial institutions to know what kind of trade they might be financing, to also be aware of the goods that are being shipped that they might finance. What do you think in that sense is the responsibility of the compliance officer in 2024, and how they need to stay up to date and train their team when we see so much like new topics entering the sanctions compliance officers job description?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, as compliance officers, we don't generate any revenue. We're revenue enablers. So we need to figure out, what's going on in regards to sanctions and direct that training appropriately. But compliance officers have to stay up to date with everything. If you have a coverage order, a coverage area, and say investment banking, equities, fixing, whatever it might be, there could be implications in your coverage area because of these sanctions. So, that means staying up to date and doing your own training in coordination with sanctions to make sure that everybody's aware of what to do. So, if you're working, for example, I'll say a hypothetical, in a trading area, who are you trading with? We have to ensure that obviously we're not trading with anyone on the list, but also that they're equipped to handle all the new changes that are occurring.
Yeah, thanks. I just had another thought. Oh yeah, the frequency of the trainings. You obviously the changes are so rapid lately. In the guidance, for example, by OFAC, they maybe mention the frequency of how often you should train your direct sanctions compliance people and then the general staff. And it used to be, okay, 2 times a year for your sanctions people and 1 time per year for people who are in other departments of the company that don't need regular training. But how is it now compared to the previous years? Should we train more frequently?
The frequency, I guess the dissemination of information from our regulators is that they're really keen more than ever to look at training materials and make sure that people were educated on a customized basis, not so high level. So when I mentioned earlier about your program, if you do the right due diligence and you incorporate all the risks of the organization, you'll see on your schedule of training, how you align specific risks to specific teams or departments. Now, based on all that analysis, you're probably going to meet the regulatory requirements, even if you don't even know it. But you have to be very conscious because each regulator is, disseminating different information. But, for sanctions in particular, it's really important to stay up on it. Think about having an account with somebody on the list. It's not a real good look, especially for your reputational risk. And to say it mildly.
You have provided sanctions compliance training to a lot of companies in your past, right? This is your main business. How would you suggest should small, medium, and large companies provide training this year? Should it be an in-house person preparing the training? Because if I'm a compliance manager, I already have so much on my plate. How will I create a training for my sanctions team and the management and the general staff of my company? I need like 3 different training materials, 3 different courses. I need to schedule meetings and schedule the training and get people on board. This is so much work for a compliance manager. Wouldn't it be easier to outsource compliance training? And how do regulators look at external compliance training being provided? Is that something they encourage?
Well, I'll say that anytime you're doing training, you should have a really balanced approach. I'm not saying, bring in external sources all the time, but use it where Alex, at the beginning, you mentioned this OFAC expert that you had on asking questions. If you want to bring in an OFAC expert and do a training, that's great. That's outside experience that a lot of people can benefit from. But, the individuals doing training, and I always say in coordination with a compliance lead, it's a lot to take in, but if you don't have that right structure and right steps, it could be exhausting. So all that due diligence that you do at the beginning of the year to set the tone for your program, it makes it that much easier to adjust it in year. You got to have that flexibility or placeholders in case something new comes out. And, you might have to do different trainings for management, for the sanctions team, and so, customizing. But they're all going to have the same foundational elements that you could build on for different audiences.
The training material needs to adapt, right? Last year we've seen a lot of enforcement cases which focused on cryptocurrency, evasion of sanctions, and using technology in your due diligence and screening, right? So we did a broadcast in July last year where we talked about using geolocation data for sanction screening, because the regulators find a couple of companies that offered their services to people located in sanctioned jurisdictions such as Crimea, Syria, or Iran. How do you include like recent developments or guidance documents in your training?
You know, it's you're going to love this answer. It depends, right? Because the relevant information or all these resource materials might not be pertinent for everybody. You know, you have to really pick and choose who it's going to be. And you also have to think how adults learn these days. You know, their retention and attention span is, you know, just based on reading, in my estimation, is not where it should be. So if you put somebody in a room for 2 hours and it's pure lecture, the retention of information they're going to obtain is not going to be so high. So you know, takeaway materials, supporting reference materials, people could resort to. Think about it, like how much of a session do you really remember? 15%. So, you know, those job aids, either they're role specific, department specific, that's what people need to function. They have to resort back. And you got to make sure.
That's a really important point. How much do we take away from a compliance training? I could be somewhere else in my mind for like an hour because I think this is not important to me or my department. So if nobody tests my knowledge, I would probably be way too relaxed during the training. Do you think that every training should have a test at the end?
You know, like, first of all, like with, you know, I do look at adult learning methodologies, and, you know, based on, I think it was a learning pyramid, the worst mention is lecture, right? And then you follow it all the way down to, you know, working with other teammates so they understand. If really lecture, Alex, yeah, you're right. People aren't going to remember much. If it's interactive and people are involved, you know, they'll be able to remember more than if it was just lecture. So you have to make sure that your approach, your medium of delivery, and everything is up to par, knowing your audience. And again, I mentioned that, knowing audience, that's the most important part to deal with effective training.
Yeah, I think that taking away some documents after compliance training is really cool, especially if they have been simplified and kind of gamified, where you look at it and you actually enjoy looking at them with, you know, graphs and decision trees and things like that. I really appreciate takeaways like this from events. But when I just, like you said, when I just listened to a lecture for an hour, like I used to at university, I had to read all the materials after the class again to get it into my head. Um, I think there's a function within this broadcast which allows us to receive your questions from the audience. I think that if you comment under the live broadcast with your questions, with a couple of seconds of delay, I would be able to see them coming in. So I want to open up this broadcast now to our attendees. I think we have around 90 attending, 90 people. I've seen a comment by Marta who is asking if the video recording will be made available, and it is, because the moment we stop recording, it will already be uploaded on LinkedIn, and you can rewatch this anytime and share it with your friends and colleagues. I can actually see we have 135 people, or 134. So please submit your comments and we will receive them maybe with a couple of seconds of delay and try to take them. Otherwise, we will have a webinar on this, which will go much deeper into all the core pillars of sanctions compliance training. And if you're an ACSS member by May this year, you will be able to see Justin go deeper into what we discussed today. And we have more time for Q&A after each ACSS webinar. So I don't know if you see any comments coming in. I didn't. Thank you everyone for Thank you everyone for joining us today from wherever you are. I know it's late for our European attendees, and we hope that the time for the webinar training will suit you all. Thanks, Justin, for giving us a quick presentation of compliance training, and I'm looking forward to our webinar in May. If anyone needs compliance training right now, please contact Justin through LinkedIn. Reach out to him because he is teaching on sanctions and how to create the best compliance training for sanctions departments. And he will be available to answer your questions through LinkedIn. If you need his email address, please reach out to me. And keep your people up to date. We just saw the 13th EU sanctions package has been published last week. Hopefully it will decrease in terms of updates that we've seen in 2023. There's going to be much more enforcements by regulators this year. So stay up to date with everything that we do at ACSS. Visit our website for the upcoming webinars. We have free webinars and only members webinars. And we also have Sanctions Connect calls. A quick overview of our webinars that we have for you. This Thursday, we have a really cool webinar with LexisNexis, which is combating wildlife trafficking through collaboration. So join us on Thursday morning or Thursday afternoon, wherever you are. A week later, we will discuss employment discrimination and export control laws and how your human resource department might be affected by export control regulations. You might not be aware of it. And then a week later, we will look at the US semiconductor industry and the latest Commerce BAS export controls. Thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see you in our next broadcast. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Alex, for having me.